Everyone, may I have your attention? For just a moment, tonight is a very special evening. I'd like you all to meet the wonderful young woman who will soon become part of our family. Emily, you've brought so much happiness into Nathan's life. I want you to have this as a small welcome gift.
Mrs. Carter, this is beautiful. Thank you so much. I don't know what to say.
The applause began before anyone noticed the woman standing alone near the back of the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors as nearly 200 guests rose to their feet, smiling and clapping for a moment that would soon become impossible to forget. At the center of the celebration, a well-dressed woman lifted a champagne glass and called for everyone's attention. Beside her stood a younger woman wearing an elegant white evening gown, her nervous smile growing wider as cameras flashed around the room. Tonight, the older woman announced proudly, "Our family is welcoming someone very special, someone who represents a beautiful new beginning for my son." More applause filled the room. Some guests exchanged puzzled looks. Others simply followed the crowd. Across the ballroom, Vivian Carter quietly lowered her glass and watched without saying a single word. She was not a distant relative. She was not an old girlfriend. She was still Nathan Carter's legal wife. Yet she had just watched another woman receive a standing ovation for taking her place. Nathan stood only a few feet away, saying nothing as his mother slipped a sparkling diamond bracelet onto the younger woman's wrist. Every camera turned toward the stage. No one noticed Vivian except the ballroom manager, who briefly met her eyes before giving a respectful nod that lasted less than a second. That silent exchange carried a meaning nobody else in the room could possibly understand. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Most people would remember that evening as the night a powerful family celebrated a new beginning. They would remember the expensive decorations, the live orchestra, the perfectly arranged flowers, and the endless stream of smiling photographs shared across social media before midnight. What almost nobody understood was that the celebration had been built on a dangerous assumption. The guests believed the Carter family owned the luxury hotel where the event was taking place. They believed Nathan's success had paid for every elegant detail surrounding them. They believed Vivian had already lost everything that mattered. Every one of those beliefs was wrong. Long before the invitations had been printed, long before the orchestra had been hired, and long before Nathan's mother began planning the evening, ownership records had already told a completely different story. Those records were sitting safely inside a law office downtown, signed years earlier, witnessed, registered, and impossible to dispute. Vivian had never mentioned them because she never felt the need to explain what legally belonged to her. She believed marriage should be built on trust rather than financial statements. She never imagined that silence would one day allow nearly everyone around her to create a version of reality that existed only in their own minds. The woman standing beside Nathan was named Emily Brooks. She was 32 years old, intelligent, warm, and successful in her own career as an event consultant. Friends described her as generous and optimistic, someone who believed the best in people until they gave her a reason not to. Nearly a year earlier, she had met Nathan while organizing a charity fundraiser for local businesses. Nathan introduced himself as a businessman trapped inside a marriage that had already ended emotionally. According to him, he and Vivian were simply waiting for paperwork to be completed before moving on with separate lives. He described years of loneliness, endless arguments, and two people who had quietly accepted that their marriage could no longer be repaired. Emily believed him because nothing about his behavior suggested otherwise. He never wore his wedding ring during their meetings. He never spoke kindly about his marriage. Yet he also never spoke with hatred. Instead, he painted himself as a man trying to leave an unhappy chapter with dignity. Like many intelligent people, Emily never considered that the most convincing lies are often built around small pieces of truth, carefully arranged to hide something much larger. Nathan's mother, Margaret Carter, had admired Emily almost immediately. To her, Emily represented everything she believed her son deserved. She was outgoing where Vivian remained reserved. She enjoyed hosting parties while Vivian preferred quiet evenings. She openly praised Nathan in conversations with friends, something Margaret rarely witnessed from Vivian because Vivian believed private affection did not need a public audience. Over time, Margaret convinced herself that her opinions were facts. She stopped referring to Emily as Nathan's friend and quietly began introducing her as family. At first, only a few close relatives heard those introductions. Eventually, neighbors heard them. Church friends heard them. Business associates heard them. Every retelling made Nathan's marriage sound more distant than it really was. Every conversation pushed Vivian further outside a story that still legally included her. Nathan occasionally suggested slowing down, but he never truly corrected his mother. Remaining silent felt easier than admitting the truth. Unfortunately, silence has a way of becoming permission when repeated often enough. And before long, Margaret was planning a celebration that assumed Vivian would simply disappear without asking a single question. Vivian had always been the quietest person in any room she entered. Some mistook that quietness for insecurity. Others assumed it meant she lacked confidence. Neither assumption came close to the truth. At 41, she had built a reputation among investors and business leaders for making thoughtful decisions without seeking attention. Years before meeting Nathan, she had inherited a diversified investment company created by her late grandfather, a man who believed real wealth should create opportunities rather than headlines. Under Vivian's leadership, the company expanded into commercial real estate, hospitality, logistics, and retirement communities across several states. She rarely appeared in interviews, avoided magazine profiles, and preferred allowing her executive team to represent the company publicly. Even after marrying Nathan, she chose not to discuss finances inside the family unless absolutely necessary. She paid bills quietly, supported charitable causes privately, and believed generosity lost its meaning when it became a performance. Nathan appreciated those qualities during the early years of their marriage. He often told friends that Vivian's calm nature balanced his own ambition. Somewhere along the way, however, admiration slowly gave way to expectation, and expectation eventually transformed into entitlement without either of them recognizing the moment everything began to change. By the end of the evening, guests continued laughing, dancing, and congratulating Nathan and Emily as if the future had already been decided. Vivian remained gracious, thanked the staff members who greeted her, wished several elderly relatives a safe trip home, and quietly walked toward the hotel entrance without interrupting a single celebration. Nathan noticed her leaving, but stayed where he was, convincing himself there would be time to explain everything later. He had no idea that the choices made inside that ballroom had already set another process into motion. Across town, an attorney named Benjamin Hayes had just received confirmation that documents requested several weeks earlier were ready for review. Inside one sealed envelope rested information capable of changing every assumption Nathan's family had built over the past year. Vivian already knew exactly what those documents contained. She simply hadn't decided when everyone else deserved to learn the truth. Sometimes people expose themselves more completely when no one rushes to stop them. And before this story reached its end, every smile captured in the photographs from that glamorous evening would come to represent a memory none of them would ever wish to relive. The morning after the celebration, photographs from the event spread quickly across social media. Friends congratulated Nathan, relatives left heart emojis beneath smiling pictures, and people who knew only part of the story commented about new beginnings, without realizing the marriage they believed had ended was still legally intact. Vivian saw the photographs while drinking her morning coffee, but showed no sign of anger. She simply closed the application, picked up her tablet, and reviewed the day's business schedule. By 8:30, she was already seated inside the executive boardroom of Carter Legacy Holdings. The room overlooked the city's financial district, where dozens of companies competed for attention every day. Vivian never needed attention. She preferred results. As directors discussed quarterly reports, new acquisitions, and expansion plans, she listened carefully before asking a handful of thoughtful questions that immediately exposed problems several executives had overlooked. Those around the table respected her because she never spoke merely to fill silence. Every word carried purpose. None of them knew that only 12 hours earlier, she had watched another woman publicly welcomed into what was still legally her marriage. When the meeting ended, several executives complimented her composure during difficult negotiations with a major investor. They had no idea that the most difficult negotiation waiting for Vivian had nothing to do with business. It involved loyalty, truth, and a family that had slowly convinced itself that kindness could be mistaken for weakness. Across town, Nathan struggled to concentrate at work. His phone buzzed almost constantly with congratulatory messages from relatives who believed the previous evening had marked the beginning of a happier chapter in his life. Every notification tightened the knot forming in his stomach. The celebration had not unfolded exactly as his mother imagined. Instead of reacting emotionally, Vivian had remained calm, and that silence unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. He replayed the image of her quietly watching from across the ballroom. She had not pleaded for explanations. She had not embarrassed anyone. She had simply observed. Nathan knew his wife well enough to understand that she rarely acted without careful thought. That realization stayed with him throughout the day. During lunch, Emily called to thank him for the beautiful evening. Her excitement was genuine, yet beneath her cheerful voice lingered uncertainty. "Do you think Vivian knew?" she asked softly. Nathan hesitated before answering. "She knows we're having problems." Emily remained quiet for several seconds. "That's not what I asked." Nathan looked through the office window before finally replying, "Everything will be sorted out soon." Even as he spoke those words, they sounded less convincing than they had only a week earlier. Promises become difficult to believe when the person making them has already begun questioning them. Margaret Carter experienced no such uncertainty. She spent the afternoon calling relatives who had been unable to attend the celebration, happily describing every detail as though she had personally witnessed the beginning of a fairy tale. Emily looked absolutely radiant, she told one cousin. You should have seen how everyone welcomed her. When a relative cautiously asked whether Nathan's divorce had been finalized, Margaret dismissed the question with a confident laugh. "That's only paperwork," she replied. "Everyone already knows that marriage has been over for years." The statement spread from one conversation to another until it gradually transformed into accepted truth among people who had never spoken directly with Vivian. Rumors often travel faster than facts because they ask so little from the people repeating them. Margaret genuinely believed she was protecting her son's future. She never stopped to consider whether the future she imagined was built on information she had never verified. Late that afternoon, she visited a luxury furniture showroom with Emily, enthusiastically discussing how certain pieces would look inside Nathan's home after everything was settled. Emily smiled politely, though something continued bothering her. During the ballroom celebration, she had expected an emotional confrontation from Vivian. Instead, she received a calm glance and a respectful nod before Vivian quietly walked away. For reasons she could not explain, that brief moment stayed with her longer than the applause. That same afternoon, Vivian arrived at the downtown offices of attorney Benjamin Hayes. Benjamin had represented her family for nearly 20 years and knew every detail surrounding the trusts, property holdings, and investment structures established by her late grandfather. He greeted Vivian warmly before placing a thick folder on the conference table. "I've reviewed everything," he said. "There are no surprises from a legal standpoint." Vivian nodded. "I wasn't expecting any." Benjamin studied her expression carefully. "How are you holding up?" She offered a small smile. "I've had better weeks." The attorney leaned back in his chair. "You understand that once divorce proceedings begin, they'll eventually discover the ownership records." Vivian looked toward the window overlooking downtown traffic. "I know. Do you want to tell Nathan before then?" She remained silent for several moments before answering. "No." Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Vivian folded her hands neatly on the table. "Because he has lived beside me for 11 years. If he never cared enough to understand the life we built together, a last-minute explanation won't change what brought us here." Benjamin nodded slowly. Experience had taught him that broken trust could not be repaired with financial disclosures. Whatever happened next would be determined by facts already recorded long before Nathan's family began imagining a future that belonged to someone else. As evening settled over the city, Nathan finally returned home. The house felt unusually quiet. Vivian sat in the library reading a biography while soft classical music played in the background. She looked up briefly when he entered, smiled politely, and returned to her book. Nathan stood awkwardly near the doorway. "Can we talk?" he asked. Vivian closed the book and rested it beside her chair. "Of course." He took a deep breath. "About last night." She waited patiently. "Mom shouldn't have done that." Vivian nodded once. "No, she shouldn't have." Nathan expected anger, disappointment, perhaps even tears. Instead, her calm agreement left him searching for words. "I'm sorry you were embarrassed," he said quietly. Vivian held his gaze before replying. "Nathan, embarrassment passes. Character stays with us much longer." Those few words settled heavily between them. She wished him a peaceful evening, picked up her book, and continued reading. Nathan slowly walked upstairs, carrying a feeling he had not experienced in years. For the first time since everything began, he realized the greatest danger facing him was not losing an argument or dividing property. It was discovering, far too late, that the woman he had spent years taking for granted no longer expected anything from him at all. And once expectations disappear, relationships often become impossible to save. 3 days passed without another confrontation. To anyone looking from the outside, life appeared remarkably normal. Nathan left for work every morning. Vivian continued managing her company, and Margaret remained convinced the difficult part was already behind them. She believed silence meant acceptance. She believed the absence of an argument meant victory. It never crossed her mind that some people stop arguing because they have already made peace with the outcome. Vivian did not spend her days wondering how to change Nathan's mind. She spent them preparing for the next chapter of her life. Every appointment on her calendar moved forward as planned. She reviewed contracts, approved expansion proposals, met with architects for a new retirement community, and signed documents for the purchase of another commercial property. Her assistant noticed nothing unusual except that Vivian had become even more focused than usual. When people experience deep disappointment, they often react in one of two ways. Some allow pain to interrupt every part of their lives. Others quietly pour their energy into the things they can still control. Vivian belonged to the second group. She had long ago learned that no amount of worrying could rewrite yesterday, but thoughtful decisions could still shape tomorrow. Nathan, however, found it impossible to focus. Every conversation seemed to remind him of the celebration. Colleagues congratulated him on starting fresh, unaware that his marriage had not officially ended. Clients joked about his new chapter, repeating rumors they had heard from mutual acquaintances. Each comment left him more uncomfortable than the last. He had never intended for his private life to become public entertainment, yet that was exactly what had happened. During lunch, he received another call from his mother. Margaret sounded unusually cheerful. She excitedly explained that several relatives wanted to organize another family gathering so everyone could spend more time getting to know Emily. Nathan interrupted her before she could finish. "Mom, slow down." She laughed. "Why?" "Everyone loved her." Nathan rubbed his forehead. "Nothing has been finalized." There was a brief silence before Margaret answered. "That's only a matter of time." Nathan looked through the restaurant window at people hurrying along the sidewalk. For the first time, he wondered whether his mother had become so invested in the future she imagined that she no longer recognized the reality standing in front of her. He ended the call politely, but the conversation stayed with him long after lunch had ended. Emily was beginning to ask herself questions she had avoided for months. She had always believed honesty mattered more than appearances, and lately too many small details refused to fit together. Nathan often promised that everything would soon be resolved, yet nothing actually changed. Vivian still lived in the family home. There had been no official separation announcement. Friends who knew both women spoke carefully whenever the subject came up, as though they understood something Emily did not. One afternoon, she met her longtime friend Rebecca for coffee. After listening quietly, Rebecca asked a simple question. "Have you ever spoken to Vivian?" Emily shook her head immediately. "No." Rebecca stirred her coffee before looking back at her. "Then everything you know about that marriage came from Nathan." Emily didn't answer. The observation was impossible to ignore because it was completely true. She had accepted one version of events without ever questioning whether another version existed. Rebecca reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "I'm not saying Nathan lied to you. I'm saying every story has more than one voice." Emily nodded thoughtfully. She left the cafe carrying more uncertainty than when she had arrived. For the first time since meeting Nathan, she realized she had been building important decisions on information she had never personally verified. That same afternoon, Benjamin Hayes called Vivian with an update. "We've received another inquiry," he said after exchanging greetings. Vivian closed the file she had been reviewing. "From Nathan's attorney?" "Yes." Benjamin paused briefly. "This time they're requesting additional information about jointly held assets." Vivian smiled faintly. "There aren't many." Benjamin returned the smile. "Exactly." He explained that the request suggested Nathan's legal team still believed substantial marital property existed, despite the public records indicating otherwise. Vivian thanked him for the update before ending the call. She sat quietly for several minutes, reflecting not on the legal process, but on the years that had led to this point. Nathan had never once asked how her grandfather structured the family investments. He never showed interest in the trust documents, the property portfolios, or the history behind the company she managed every day. She had interpreted his lack of curiosity as trust. Now she wondered whether it had actually been indifference. There is an important difference between respecting someone's privacy and simply assuming everything they have will eventually become yours. One reflects love, the other reflects expectation. Vivian no longer believed she needed to explain that difference. The documents would do it for her soon enough. Later that evening, Margaret hosted a small dinner for a handful of relatives at her home. The conversation naturally drifted toward Nathan's future, and before long she began speaking confidently about plans that had not yet become reality. She described vacations she imagined Nathan and Emily would take together, renovations she expected them to make, and family traditions she believed they would continue. Several relatives smiled politely, but one elderly uncle quietly interrupted. "Margaret," he said, "have you ever considered that Vivian hasn't said much because she knows something the rest of us don't?" The room fell silent. Margaret laughed dismissively, insisting there was nothing left to know. The uncle simply nodded and returned to his meal. He had spent nearly 50 years running a successful construction business and had learned that the loudest person in the room was rarely the one holding the strongest position. As the dinner continued, Margaret noticed several family members exchanging thoughtful glances instead of enthusiastic smiles. A feeling she had ignored for weeks slowly returned. It was small, almost impossible to describe, but it lingered in the back of her mind. For the first time since introducing Emily at the ballroom celebration, she began to wonder whether Vivian's silence had never been surrender at all. And while that question quietly settled into Margaret's thoughts, another envelope was already making its way toward Nathan's attorney's office, carrying information that would soon make every assumption his family had repeated impossible to defend. By the beginning of the following week, the atmosphere inside the Carter home had changed in subtle ways that only someone living there every day could notice. Conversations had become shorter. Meals were quieter. Even the familiar routines that once made the house feel comfortable now carried an uncomfortable distance. Nathan found himself watching Vivian more closely than ever before, searching for some sign that she intended to confront him, accuse him, or demand an explanation. Instead, she continued living with the same quiet discipline that had defined her long before their marriage began. She left for work at the same hour every morning, returned home in the evening, answered messages from her executive team, and spent an hour reading before bed. Nothing appeared different, yet everything felt different. Nathan realized he could no longer predict what she was thinking, and that uncertainty slowly became more exhausting than any argument could have been. People often believe silence is empty, but silence has a remarkable way of forcing others to hear the thoughts they have been avoiding. Nathan had spent months convincing himself he understood exactly how the future would unfold. Now, for the first time, he wasn't certain of anything. The confidence that had once carried him through every difficult conversation was beginning to disappear, replaced by questions he could no longer ignore. Across town, Margaret remained determined to move forward with the future she had imagined. She invited Emily to lunch at one of the city's most exclusive country clubs, eager to reassure her that everything was progressing exactly as planned. The elegant dining room overlooked a championship golf course, where members enjoyed the afternoon sunshine, and for a while, the conversation stayed light. Margaret complimented Emily's dress, discussed upcoming charity events, and spoke enthusiastically about introducing her to more members of the extended family. Eventually, however, Emily placed her fork down and asked the question that had been weighing on her mind for days. Has Nathan officially filed for divorce? Margaret hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering. His attorney is taking care of everything. Emily looked down at her plate. That's not really what I asked. Margaret forced a reassuring smile. These things take time. Emily nodded politely, but the answer did little to ease her growing concern. She had entered the relationship believing she was becoming part of a new beginning. Now she found herself wondering whether she had unknowingly stepped into the middle of a story that had never been as simple as she had been told. As they left the club, Emily noticed several members greeting Margaret warmly while quietly avoiding any mention of Nathan. It was a small detail, yet it stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon. That same day, Benjamin Hayes invited Vivian to his office after receiving additional documents from the county records department. He carefully spread several certified copies across the conference table before looking at her. I think you should see these before anyone else does. Vivian examined the paperwork without saying a word. Every document confirmed what she already knew. The luxury hotel where Margaret had hosted the celebration had been purchased 6 years earlier through Carter Legacy Hospitality, a company wholly owned by Vivian's family trust. The ballroom, the guest suites, the restaurants, even the conference center where countless family events had been held over the years all fell under the same ownership structure. Benjamin quietly observed her expression. Your mother-in-law chose one of your own properties to celebrate replacing you. Vivian gave a faint smile, though there was sadness behind it rather than satisfaction. She never asked who owned it. Benjamin folded his hands. Neither did Nathan. Vivian looked out the window before replying. No, he never cared enough to ask. Benjamin explained that Nathan's attorney had now formally requested an inventory of all marital assets. Once the legal response was filed, every assumption about ownership would disappear. Vivian thanked him for the update and gathered the documents without celebration. She wasn't interested in surprising anyone. She simply wanted the truth to arrive in its own time, supported by facts that required no argument. Late that evening, Nathan finally gathered the courage to knock on the library door where Vivian sat reviewing a proposal for a new senior living community. She looked up and quietly invited him inside. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Nathan walked toward the bookshelf, pretending to study the titles while searching for the right words. I've been thinking about everything, he said at last. Vivian closed the folder on her lap. So have I. Nathan nodded slowly. I know I've made mistakes. She waited patiently, giving him every opportunity to continue. I should have handled things differently. Again, she said nothing. Finally, he looked directly at her. Do you hate me? Vivian's expression softened, though not in the way he expected. No, Nathan, she answered quietly. Hate takes energy. I've stopped spending my energy on things I can't change. The words settled over the room with quiet finality. Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. He had hoped for anger because anger leaves room for reconciliation. What he found instead was acceptance, and acceptance often signals that someone has already begun walking away emotionally. As he slowly left the library, neither of them noticed the email arriving in Benjamin Hayes' inbox at that exact moment. It came from Nathan's attorney, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss recently discovered property records. The questions Nathan had been avoiding for months were about to receive answers, and those answers would begin unraveling every plan his family believed was already secured. The urgent meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Nathan arrived at his attorney's office, expecting another routine discussion about paperwork, timelines, and negotiation strategies. Instead, he immediately noticed something different. The usual confidence on his attorney's face had been replaced with careful professionalism, the kind people wear when they know the conversation ahead will disappoint someone sitting across from them. After exchanging greetings, the attorney closed the conference room door and placed a thick folder on the table. Before we discuss the divorce, he began, there are several matters involving property ownership that require clarification. Nathan nodded without concern. Go ahead. The attorney opened the file and slid the first document across the polished table. Have you ever personally reviewed the ownership records for your residence? Nathan frowned. Why would I? The attorney looked at him for a moment before answering. Because your name doesn't appear on the deed. Nathan stared at the document. Then he looked again, convinced he had overlooked something. Only one name appeared as the legal owner. Vivian Carter. There was no mistake. No missing page. No second owner listed beneath hers. Nathan leaned back slowly. There has to be another document. The attorney quietly shook his head. We've checked every filing available. Nathan forced a nervous laugh that lasted only a few seconds. The house is just one property. The attorney remained silent. That silence carried far more weight than any explanation could have. Nathan suddenly remembered the calm expression on Vivian's face the night of the celebration, the brief nod from the ballroom manager, and the confidence she never seemed to lose. For the first time, those memories began connecting in ways he had never considered. The attorney continued opening file after file. Each contained another certified record, another signature, another legal filing dating back years before Nathan had ever questioned his marriage. The downtown office building, where Vivian's company operated, belonged to a family trust established by her grandfather. The lakeside retreat, where Margaret proudly hosted holiday gatherings every Thanksgiving, belonged to the same trust. Several commercial properties Nathan had casually referred to as our investments were, in fact, owned entirely through holding companies that listed Vivian as the sole beneficiary. Nathan rubbed both hands across his face, trying to absorb what he was seeing. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered. "We've been married for 11 years. The attorney nodded sympathetically. "Marriage doesn't automatically change ownership of inherited property." Nathan looked down at the growing stack of documents. One question echoed inside his mind more loudly than all the others. Did Vivian know I believed everything belonged to both of us? The attorney chose his words carefully. "I can't answer what she believed. I can only tell you what the records show." Nathan sat motionless. He wasn't just discovering financial information. He was discovering how little he had actually understood about the woman he had lived beside for more than a decade. The realization felt heavier than any legal document resting on the table in front of him. Across town, Vivian spent the afternoon visiting one of her newest retirement communities under construction. She walked through unfinished hallways with the project manager, discussing accessibility features, landscaping plans, and community gathering spaces where future residents would spend time with their families. Construction workers greeted her warmly as she moved through the site, not because she owned the project, but because she remembered names, listened carefully, and treated everyone with respect. During a short break, her phone rang. Benjamin Hayes was calling. "I thought you'd want an update," he said. Vivian stepped outside, where a gentle breeze moved through rows of newly planted trees. "How did the meeting go?" Benjamin paused briefly before replying. "Nathan knows about the house." Vivian looked toward the nearly completed building in front of her. "Only the house? For now, he's still processing everything else." She closed her eyes for a moment before quietly thanking him. There was no celebration in her voice, no satisfaction, only the quiet acceptance of someone watching a truth finally reach the person who had ignored it for far too long. Benjamin hesitated before asking one final question. "Are you all right?" Vivian smiled faintly. "I'm not happy about any of this, Benjamin, but I'm ready for it." After ending the call, she stood silently for several moments. Sometimes the hardest part of letting go isn't losing someone. It's accepting that the person you believed they were existed only in your hopes and not in reality. That evening, Nathan drove directly to his mother's house without calling ahead. Margaret opened the front door expecting casual conversation, but her smile disappeared the moment she saw his face. "Nathan, what happened?" He walked inside without answering immediately. After several long seconds, he finally spoke. "The house belongs to Vivian." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said." She laughed nervously, assuming there had been some misunderstanding. "You're married. It's your house too." Nathan slowly shook his head. "No. Legally it isn't." Margaret's smile faded completely. "Well, what about the hotel?" Nathan didn't answer. "Nathan?" He looked directly at her. "That belongs to her too." The room fell silent. Margaret sat down heavily on the nearest chair, as if the strength had suddenly left her legs. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible." Nathan reached into his briefcase and handed her copies of the ownership records. She scanned the pages, growing quieter with each line she read. Every signature, every filing date, every official seal confirmed the same reality. The celebration she had proudly organized had taken place inside a property controlled by the very woman she had publicly humiliated. For the first time since this entire situation began, Margaret felt genuine fear. Not fear of losing an argument, but fear that she had spent months building her family's future on assumptions that had never been true. Later that night, Emily received an unexpected phone call from Margaret, asking her to come over immediately. The moment she arrived, she sensed something had changed. The confidence that usually filled the Carter home had disappeared. Nathan sat quietly in the living room, while several folders lay open across the coffee table. Margaret looked exhausted, and neither of them rushed to explain why. Emily finally broke the silence. "Can someone tell me what's going on?" Nathan slowly pushed one document toward her. She looked down and read only the first page, before lifting her eyes in confusion. "This says Vivian owns the hotel." Nathan nodded. Emily picked up another file, then another. Her expression changed with every page she turned. No one spoke while she continued reading. When she finally looked back at Nathan, the question she asked was calm, but it carried a weight that neither he nor Margaret had prepared for. If all of this is true, she said quietly, what else haven't you told me? Nathan lowered his eyes. He searched for an answer that could somehow explain months of half-truths, assumptions, and promises. None came. Outside, the evening grew darker, but inside the Carter home, something even more significant had changed. For the first time, the people who had confidently written Vivian out of their future were beginning to realize they had never truly understood the present. And the next discovery waiting inside Benjamin Hayes's office would challenge far more than property ownership. It would force everyone involved to confront the choices that had brought them to this moment. The following morning felt unusually quiet inside the Carter household. Nathan barely slept, and when he finally did, his rest was interrupted by the same thought repeating over and over again. How had he lived beside Vivian for more than a decade without truly understanding the foundation of her life? It wasn't simply about money anymore. It was about everything he had failed to notice. He remembered the countless evenings she spent reviewing reports after dinner, while he casually assumed she was managing routine office work. He remembered charity galas where executives greeted her with remarkable respect, and he dismissed it as professional courtesy. He remembered board members waiting for her opinion before making major decisions, yet he never questioned why they valued her judgment so highly. Looking back, the signs had always been there. He simply never cared enough to connect them. It became painfully clear that he had accepted the benefits of Vivian's success without ever taking genuine interest in how she had achieved it. Somewhere along the way, appreciation had quietly turned into expectation. That realization hurt far more than discovering whose name appeared on legal documents. Financial mistakes can often be corrected. Character flaws are much harder to confront because they force people to see themselves without excuses. Margaret refused to accept what the documents revealed. Throughout the morning, she called relatives, accountants, and even an old family friend who had worked in commercial banking for years. She hoped someone would tell her there had been a misunderstanding, that marriage automatically changed ownership, or that some hidden agreement existed giving Nathan equal control over everything. Every conversation ended the same way. The records appeared legitimate. The inheritance had been properly structured. The trusts had been established years before Nathan entered Vivian's life. No amount of disbelief could rewrite legally recorded facts. By lunchtime, Margaret's confidence had faded into frustration. She looked around her own living room and suddenly realized how often she had mocked Vivian for spending time at work instead of attending family lunches or neighborhood gatherings. She had interpreted discipline as coldness because she never bothered to understand the responsibility Vivian carried every single day. Still, pride refused to let Margaret admit she had been wrong. Instead, she convinced herself there had to be another opportunity. There must be something Nathan is entitled to, she muttered repeatedly, almost as though saying the words aloud could somehow make them true. Unfortunately for her, hope built on assumptions rarely survives contact with documented facts. Emily spent the day alone in her apartment, unable to focus on anything else. The folders she had read the previous evening remained fresh in her memory. She wasn't thinking about hotels or investment companies nearly as much as she was thinking about trust. Nathan had never directly claimed he owned those properties, yet he never corrected anyone when they assumed he did. He allowed conversations to continue, accepted admiration that wasn't entirely earned, and built plans around a future he apparently didn't fully understand himself. Emily replayed every conversation they had shared during the past year, searching for moments she might have ignored. She remembered asking whether his divorce had already begun. His answers had always sounded confident without actually being specific. She remembered asking whether Vivian knew about their relationship. Again, his replies left just enough room to avoid outright dishonesty, while still leading her toward the conclusion he wanted her to reach. Emily had always believed deception required obvious lies. Now she understood that carefully avoiding the full truth could cause just as much damage. She wasn't angry because Vivian owned successful businesses. She was angry because she had slowly realized that nearly every important decision she made during the past year had been based on incomplete information, deliberately left incomplete by the one person she trusted most. That afternoon, Vivian received an invitation to attend the first formal mediation session scheduled for the following week. Benjamin Hayes arrived at her office carrying several neatly organized binders containing financial records, trust agreements, ownership certificates, and decades of supporting documentation. Vivian welcomed him into the conference room where sunlight filled the large windows overlooking the city skyline. Benjamin placed the binders on the table before speaking. Everything is ready. Vivian looked over the organized files without touching them. Do you think they'll continue contesting ownership? Benjamin smiled slightly. Not after seeing this. He explained that the documentation established a clear history reaching back long before the marriage. Every major acquisition, every inheritance transfer, every company restructuring had been completed according to law and carefully preserved through years of meticulous record-keeping. There would be very little room for confusion once the mediation began. Vivian listened quietly before asking a question that surprised him. How is Nathan handling all this? Benjamin hesitated. Honestly? She nodded. He's beginning to understand that this isn't simply a financial issue. Vivian looked thoughtfully toward the window. I hope he understands something even more important. Benjamin waited. What's that? She answered softly. That the greatest thing he stood to lose was never listed on a balance sheet. Benjamin remained silent, because there was nothing he could add to a statement so painfully true. Late that evening, Nathan returned to the house earlier than usual. He found Vivian sitting on the back patio watching the sun slowly disappear beyond the trees surrounding the property. For several minutes, he simply stood beside her without speaking. Finally, he broke the silence. I've been thinking about the day we met. Vivian looked toward him with quiet curiosity. Nathan smiled sadly. You remember that little coffee shop near the river? She nodded once. You spilled coffee on your own shoes. A faint smile appeared on his face. I was nervous. Vivian almost laughed at the memory before the moment faded back into silence. Nathan looked across the backyard they had shared for so many years. I don't think I appreciated you enough, Vivian answered gently. No, Nathan. You appreciated what life with me gave you. Those aren't always the same thing. He lowered his head, knowing she was right. There was no anger in her voice, only honesty, and somehow that honesty hurt more than accusations ever could. As darkness settled over the property, neither of them noticed that another meeting had already been arranged for the following week. This one would bring together attorneys, financial records, and decades of carefully documented history. When it ended, there would be no room left for assumptions, no comforting stories, and no version of events built on wishful thinking. The truth had waited patiently for years, and now it was only days away from speaking for itself. The mediation session began on a quiet Tuesday morning inside a private conference suite overlooking the city's courthouse district. The room itself was simple, almost ordinary, with a long walnut table, leather chairs, neatly arranged folders, and large windows that framed the skyline beyond. Nothing about the setting hinted at how dramatically several lives were about to change. Nathan arrived first with his attorney, speaking very little during the few minutes they waited. His confidence from only a few months earlier had disappeared completely. He no longer walked into the room expecting to negotiate from a position of strength. Instead, he carried the uneasy feeling of someone who suspected another unpleasant surprise was waiting just beyond the next conversation. A few moments later, Benjamin Hayes entered beside Vivian. She greeted everyone politely, thanked the mediator for arranging the meeting, and quietly took her seat without displaying even the smallest sign of resentment. The mediator introduced himself, reviewed the procedures, and reminded everyone that the purpose of mediation was to reach a fair and lawful resolution. Vivian listened attentively. Nathan tried to do the same, but his thoughts kept returning to one question that had haunted him for days. How much of Vivian's life had he never truly understood? The discussion began with standard financial disclosures, before gradually moving toward property ownership. Nathan's attorney presented several questions regarding marital assets, expecting clarification on investments accumulated during the marriage. Benjamin calmly opened the first binder and slid certified documents across the table. Every page traced ownership back through years of carefully maintained records. One property after another was identified as inherited or held through family trusts established long before Nathan entered Vivian's life. The mediator carefully reviewed each document before making notes of his own. There was no disagreement because there was no conflicting evidence. After nearly 40 minutes, the mediator looked up and summarized what everyone in the room had already begun to realize. Based on the documentation provided, he said, the majority of these assets appear to be separate property rather than marital property. Nathan lowered his eyes. Even though he had been warned, hearing those words spoken aloud felt different. Final, unavoidable. Benjamin then presented ownership records for Carter Legacy Holdings, along with supporting corporate filings. The mediator reviewed the material before asking a simple question. Mr. Carter, were you ever listed as an owner, director, or beneficiary of this company? Nathan quietly answered no. Saying the word aloud forced him to confront a reality he had spent years assuming would never matter. As the meeting continued, another misunderstanding quietly disappeared. Nathan had always believed he played a significant role in supporting Vivian's business success, simply by standing beside her throughout their marriage. Benjamin acknowledged Nathan's encouragement during earlier years, but carefully explained that every major investment decision, expansion strategy, financing arrangement, and acquisition had been directed entirely through Vivian and her executive leadership team. The record showed years of board meetings, strategic planning sessions, audited financial statements, and carefully documented growth that reflected one person's consistent leadership. Nathan listened without interruption. He remembered countless evenings when Vivian returned home exhausted after difficult negotiations, while he casually asked whether work had gone well before changing the subject. He remembered vacations she postponed because an acquisition required her attention. At the time, he viewed those decisions as unnecessary devotion to work. Only now did he begin to understand the scale of responsibility she had carried while protecting thousands of employees, investors, tenants, and clients whose futures depended upon careful decisions. The company had never simply been a source of income. It represented decades of family effort that Vivian had faithfully preserved. Looking back, Nathan realized he had admired the comfort her success provided far more than the discipline required to achieve it. The mediator eventually paused the proceedings to allow everyone a short break. Nathan stepped into the hallway alone, staring through the windows toward the busy streets below. Benjamin quietly joined Vivian near a coffee station while giving her time to collect her thoughts. After a few moments, Nathan slowly approached her. His voice carried none of the confidence it once had. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian nodded. "Of course." He hesitated before speaking. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" She looked at him with genuine curiosity. "Tell you what?" He searched for the right words. "How much you actually owned." Vivian answered almost immediately. "Because I never thought it mattered." Nathan looked confused. She continued softly. "When we married, I believed we were building a life together, not comparing financial statements." He remained silent. Vivian's expression reflected sadness rather than bitterness. "I wanted someone who loved me for who I was after work ended, not for what I signed during business hours." Nathan looked away. The hallway suddenly felt much quieter than before. For years, he had assumed Vivian kept financial matters private because she wanted control. Standing there now, he finally understood that privacy had been an expression of trust. She believed their marriage didn't require constant proof of what belonged to whom. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing the difference. When mediation resumed, the final discussion focused on the marital residence. Benjamin presented the original purchase agreement, trust documentation, renovation records, and maintenance expenses dating back several years. Every document supported the same conclusion. The home had remained part of Vivian's inherited estate from the day it was acquired. After reviewing everything carefully, the mediator looked toward Nathan. "Mr. Carter, based on the information before me, Mrs. Carter will retain sole ownership of the residence." Nathan nodded slowly. There was no anger left to express, and no argument left to make. He had entered the marriage believing love was enough to sustain it. Somewhere along the journey, he allowed comfort, pride, and assumption to replace gratitude, honesty, and respect. Now those choices stood before him more clearly than any financial record ever could. As everyone gathered their files and prepared to leave, the mediator remarked that the remaining issues appeared relatively straightforward. Legally, he was correct. Emotionally, nothing about the situation felt simple. Nathan watched Vivian quietly organize her documents before walking toward the exit with the same calm dignity she had carried from the very beginning. He suddenly realized the greatest loss awaiting him would not be measured by homes, investments, or business interests. It would be measured by every ordinary day he would spend remembering the extraordinary woman he had failed to truly value while she was still standing beside him. The days following the mediation passed with surprising speed. From a legal standpoint, very little remained to be argued. The documentation was complete, the ownership history was clear, and both attorneys understood that prolonging the process would accomplish nothing except increase unnecessary expenses. Yet while the legal issues steadily approached their conclusion, the emotional consequences were only beginning to unfold. Nathan returned to work, but it quickly became obvious that something had changed. The confidence that once made important meetings feel effortless had disappeared. He found himself distracted by thoughts that surfaced without warning. Every familiar place carried a memory of Vivian. The restaurant where they celebrated their 5th wedding anniversary. The park where they spent Sunday mornings walking together. The small bookstore where she always insisted on buying printed copies, even after digital readers became popular. Those memories had once blended naturally into everyday life. Now they arrived one after another, each reminding him that he had spent years assuming those ordinary moments would always be there. People often imagine loss as something dramatic that happens all at once. In reality, it usually arrives quietly, revealing itself through small absences that gradually become impossible to ignore. Nathan had not yet moved out of the house, but emotionally, he had already begun experiencing what life without Vivian would actually feel like. Vivian, meanwhile, continued preparing for the next chapter of her life, with the same thoughtful discipline that had guided her through every difficult season. She met with senior executives regarding the company's newest hospitality project, approved scholarships funded through her family's charitable foundation, and spent an afternoon visiting one of the retirement communities that had recently opened under Carter Legacy Holdings. Residents greeted her warmly, thanking her for creating a place where they felt respected and safe. Vivian listened to each conversation with genuine interest, asking about families, grandchildren, hobbies, and health. As she walked through the beautifully landscaped gardens, one elderly resident smiled and said, "You must be very proud of everything you've built." Vivian paused before answering, "I'm grateful more than proud." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "There's a difference." Vivian smiled because there truly was. Pride seeks recognition. Gratitude quietly remembers the people who made success possible. She thought of her grandfather, whose values shaped the company long before she ever inherited it. She thought of employees who had remained loyal for decades. She even thought of Nathan, remembering the years when he had genuinely encouraged her dreams before their relationship slowly drifted away from the partnership they once shared. Despite everything that had happened, she found herself hoping he would eventually learn from the experience, rather than spend the rest of his life blaming circumstances he had helped create. Margaret faced a very different reality. News travels quickly through extended families, especially when those involved have spent months speaking confidently about plans that never become reality. Invitations became less frequent. Phone calls grew noticeably shorter. At church, conversations that once flowed naturally now carried an uncomfortable hesitation whenever she approached. Nobody openly criticized her, but she sensed the quiet change in how people looked at her. Several relatives who had enthusiastically supported her opinions during the previous year suddenly claimed they had never approved of introducing Emily before the divorce was finalized. Their sudden change of position frustrated Margaret, yet deep down she understood why it happened. Public confidence often disappears when private assumptions are exposed. One Saturday afternoon, she attended her niece's birthday gathering and overheard two distant cousins discussing the ballroom celebration. "I still can't believe she introduced another woman while Vivian was sitting there," one whispered. The other shook her head sadly. The worst part wasn't the introduction. It was that Vivian handled the whole thing with more grace than anyone else in the room. Margaret quietly walked away before they noticed her. For the first time since everything began, she stopped trying to defend her actions. She simply didn't have the energy anymore. Regret has a way of arriving long after opportunities to make better choices have already passed. Emily had also reached a decision. After several days of reflection, she asked Nathan to meet her at a quiet cafe near the river, where they had once shared some of their happiest conversations. When Nathan arrived, he immediately sensed that this meeting felt different from all the others. Emily looked calm, but her eyes carried the sadness of someone who had already accepted an answer before asking the question. After a few moments of silence, she spoke. "I've spent the last week thinking about everything you've told me over the past year." Nathan nodded quietly. Emily continued, "I don't believe you're an evil person." He looked up with cautious hope. She gently shook her head. "But I do believe you spent so much time convincing yourself of the story you wanted that you stopped recognizing the truth." Nathan lowered his eyes. Emily reached into her purse and placed the diamond bracelet Margaret had given her on the table between them. "I can't keep this." Nathan stared at the bracelet without touching it. Emily smiled sadly. "I wanted to build a future with an honest man. Instead, I found someone who kept waiting for tomorrow to tell the truth." A long silence followed before Nathan finally whispered, "I'm sorry." Emily nodded. "I know you are." She stood, wished him well, and quietly walked away without looking back. Nathan remained seated for several minutes, staring at the bracelet resting on the table. It suddenly felt far heavier than something so small should ever feel. That evening, Benjamin Hayes called Vivian with one final update before the court issued the official divorce decree. "Everything is ready," he explained. "The judge has approved the settlement. Once the final documents are signed, the case will be concluded." Vivian thanked him before ending the call. She stood near the living room window, watching the sunset spread warm shades of orange across the backyard she had cared for over so many years. There was no celebration waiting for her, no party, no sense of triumph, only a quiet feeling that one difficult chapter was finally reaching its natural ending. She understood something many people never do. Winning is not always about proving someone else wrong. Sometimes it simply means refusing to lose yourself while others are making poor decisions. Upstairs, Nathan slowly packed several boxes containing books, framed photographs, and personal belongings he would soon move into a modest apartment across town. As he carefully wrapped an old wedding photograph in newspaper, he paused for a long moment before placing it inside the box. The smiles in that picture belonged to two people who had once believed love alone would be enough to carry them through every season of life. Looking at the photograph now, Nathan finally understood that love cannot survive where honesty, gratitude, and respect slowly disappear. By the end of the week, the legal marriage would officially end. But the lessons waiting for everyone involved were only beginning to reveal their full meaning, and one final encounter would bring the story to a conclusion none of them could have imagined when this journey first began. The divorce became official on a bright Thursday morning, without the drama many people had expected. There were no raised voices in the courtroom, no emotional outbursts, and no last-minute surprises. After reviewing the final documents, the judge signed the order, wished both parties well, and moved on to the next case waiting on the schedule. Years of marriage had come to an end in less than 15 minutes. Vivian quietly thanked Benjamin Hayes for his steady guidance throughout the process before leaving the courthouse through a side entrance. She had no interest in speaking to reporters, who occasionally waited outside high-profile hearings or answering questions from curious acquaintances. She simply wanted to return to work. Nathan remained inside the building for several extra minutes, staring at the signed documents resting in front of him. The marriage was now part of his past, and for the first time, he fully understood that there would be no opportunity to ask for another chance. Some decisions can be delayed. Others quietly reach a point where they can never be undone. As he finally walked toward the courthouse exit, he noticed several couples entering together, smiling as they waited to receive marriage licenses. The sight lingered in his thoughts during the drive home. He remembered standing beside Vivian years earlier, believing they would always protect the promises they made to one another. Looking back, he realized that relationships rarely end because of one dramatic mistake. More often, they slowly weaken through small choices repeated over time, until one day, there is simply nothing strong enough left to hold them together. Nathan moved into a modest apartment on the edge of the city during the following weekend. It was comfortable, clean, and well-maintained, but it felt unfamiliar in ways he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, there was no library filled with Vivian's favorite books, no carefully tended garden visible from the kitchen window, and no quiet conversations over evening coffee after long days at work. The apartment contained everything he needed, yet somehow felt empty. One evening, while unpacking another box, he found an old anniversary card Vivian had written nearly 8 years earlier. Inside, she had thanked him for believing in her during a difficult period when expanding the company had required countless late nights and difficult decisions. She had ended the note with a simple sentence: "No matter how busy life becomes, coming home to you always reminds me what truly matters." Nathan read the sentence several times before carefully placing the card back inside its envelope. He realized that somewhere over the years, Vivian had continued treating him as the center of her personal life, while he gradually began treating her success as something that simply existed for his benefit. Gratitude had quietly disappeared, replaced by routine, and routine had eventually become entitlement. It was a painful truth, but one he could no longer avoid. Margaret struggled with changes she never expected to face. Family gatherings no longer revolved around her opinions, and relatives who once eagerly sought her advice had become noticeably more reserved. One Sunday after church, she found herself sitting alone in the fellowship hall while conversations continued at nearby tables. An elderly woman named Helen, whom Margaret had known for nearly 20 years, eventually walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. Without saying much, Helen handed 1 cup to Margaret and sat beside her. After several quiet moments, she spoke gently. "I've been praying for your family." Margaret managed a small smile. "Thank you." Helen nodded thoughtfully before continuing. "Can I tell you something as a friend?" Margaret agreed. Helen looked toward the church garden outside the window. "Sometimes we become so determined to arrange other people's lives that we forget they belong to them, not us." Margaret lowered her eyes. Helen wasn't accusing her. She wasn't criticizing her. She was simply offering wisdom earned through many years of experience. For reasons Margaret couldn't fully explain, those words affected her more deeply than all the legal documents she had read. She drove home in silence that afternoon, thinking not about houses, businesses, or court proceedings, but about the quiet moments when she could have chosen kindness instead of control. Regret often arrives disguised as ordinary memories, reminding people of opportunities they once overlooked without realizing their value. Several weeks later, Vivian traveled to Chicago to attend a national conference on commercial real estate and community development. Industry leaders from across the country gathered to discuss investment strategies, affordable housing initiatives, and long-term economic planning. Vivian participated in several panel discussions before spending the afternoon meeting investors and nonprofit leaders interested in expanding retirement communities in underserved areas. During one networking reception, she heard a familiar voice quietly say her name. Turning around, she found herself face-to-face with Emily. Both women paused for a brief moment before smiling politely. Emily laughed softly. "I wasn't expecting this." Vivian returned the smile. "Neither was I." They found a quieter corner of the reception hall and began talking. To Emily's surprise, there was no bitterness in Vivian's voice. They spoke about work, family, travel, and eventually the difficult circumstances that had unexpectedly connected their lives. After listening carefully, Vivian said something Emily would remember for years. "You made decisions based on what you believed was true. That doesn't make you my enemy." Emily looked down before quietly replying, "I still wish I had asked more questions." Vivian nodded gently. "We all wish that sometimes." They shared a genuine conversation built not on blame, but on understanding. When it was time to leave, Emily thanked Vivian for showing more grace than she probably deserved. Vivian simply smiled. "Grace isn't earned," she answered. "Otherwise it wouldn't be grace." As the conference came to an end, Vivian stood alone near the large windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. She reflected on everything that had happened during the previous year. She had lost a marriage she once believed would last forever. She had endured public embarrassment, private disappointment, and months of uncertainty. Yet she also discovered something valuable about herself. Difficult seasons had not changed her character. They had revealed it. Across town, Nathan sat quietly inside his apartment after another ordinary workday, slowly learning how to build a life shaped by his own choices rather than the comfort someone else had provided. Margaret had begun repairing damaged family relationships one conversation at a time, finally understanding that respect could never be demanded, only earned. Emily had moved forward with a renewed commitment to honesty, promising herself never again to build important decisions on unanswered questions. Their paths no longer crossed as often as they once had, yet each of them carried lessons that would remain long after the legal documents had been filed away. Some stories end with dramatic victories, Others end with quiet understanding. This one still had one final chapter remaining, and in that chapter, time itself would reveal which lessons each person truly carried into the future. Almost 2 years passed before the story found its final turning point. Time had done what time often does. It softened some memories while making others even clearer. Carter Legacy Holdings continued expanding into new markets, opening additional retirement communities, restoring historic hotels, and investing in projects designed to strengthen local neighborhoods rather than simply increase profits. Vivian rarely spoke publicly about her personal life. When journalists requested interviews, she redirected the conversation toward affordable housing, community investment, or the importance of responsible leadership. Employees admired her because she never allowed personal disappointment to interfere with the responsibilities she carried toward thousands of families who depended on the company's success. Her days remained busy, but they also became peaceful. Friends noticed that she laughed more often than she had during the final years of her marriage. It wasn't because she had forgotten the past. It was because she had finally stopped allowing it to occupy space in her future. Healing rarely happens all at once. It usually arrives through ordinary mornings, meaningful work, loyal friendships, and the quiet decision to stop reliving yesterday. Vivian understood that happiness was not something waiting for her at the end of the divorce. It was something she chose to rebuild one thoughtful day at a time. Nathan's life followed a different path. Living within his own means taught him lessons that comfort had once hidden from him. He worked harder than ever before, accepted responsibilities he previously overlooked, and gradually earned respect based entirely on his own performance rather than the lifestyle surrounding him. Colleagues noticed the change. He became more patient, more willing to listen, and far less interested in impressing people. Success no longer meant appearing important. It meant becoming dependable. One evening, after finishing a presentation for an upcoming project, a younger coworker asked him what the most valuable lesson of his career had been. Nathan remained silent for several moments before answering honestly. Never assume someone will always be there simply because they've always been there. The coworker smiled politely, believing the advice referred to business partnerships. Nathan didn't correct him. Some lessons become too personal to explain in a casual conversation. Later that night, while driving home, he passed the neighborhood where he and Vivian had once lived. He considered taking the familiar road for just a moment, before choosing another route instead. Looking backward had become a habit he was finally learning to break. Regret could teach valuable lessons, but it could never become a place to live. Margaret also changed in ways few people expected. After months of difficult reflection, she began volunteering at a local community center where retired teachers organized reading programs for children. At first, many volunteers knew nothing about her family or the events that had unfolded. They simply appreciated someone willing to help. The experience slowly reshaped her perspective. Listening to children read stories aloud reminded her how quickly pride and comparison disappear when people focus on serving others instead of proving themselves right. One afternoon, while organizing donated books, she unexpectedly met Helen, the same elderly friend who had gently challenged her after church months earlier. Helen smiled warmly before asking how things had been. Margaret answered with complete honesty, for perhaps the first time in years. "I've spent a long time trying to control other people's lives," she admitted. Helen nodded quietly. "And what have you learned?" Margaret looked around the room where volunteers laughed together while preparing for the afternoon program. "That I neglected my own." Helen placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "The good news is that today still belongs to you." Margaret carried those words home and repeated them often. She could not rewrite the choices that had damaged relationships, but she could choose different ones going forward. It wasn't an easy transformation, yet it was genuine, and those who knew her best gradually began noticing the difference. During the spring of that same year, Carter Legacy Holdings hosted a fundraising gala supporting scholarships for students pursuing careers in healthcare and senior services. Business leaders, educators, nonprofit organizations, and community volunteers filled the beautifully restored Grand Oak Hotel, one of Vivian's favorite restoration projects. The evening celebrated service rather than wealth, honoring individuals whose work had quietly improved the lives of others. As Vivian welcomed guests near the entrance, she noticed Nathan entering the ballroom alone. He had received an invitation because his employer had become one of the event's corporate sponsors. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Nathan walked over, offering a polite smile. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "This is an incredible event." Vivian thanked him warmly. For a moment, neither of them mentioned the past. They simply spoke as two people whose lives had once been deeply connected. Before returning to the other guests, Nathan paused. "I never properly thanked you," he said. Vivian looked at him with quiet curiosity. "For what?" He smiled sadly. "For believing in me long before I believed in myself." Vivian's expression softened. "I hope someday you'll believe in yourself for the right reasons." Nathan nodded. "I'm trying." There was no expectation of reconciliation, no lingering misunderstanding, and no bitterness remaining between them. Only mutual respect shaped by difficult lessons neither of them would ever forget. As both of them walked toward separate futures, Neither wish the other harm. Some relationships end with anger. Others end with understanding earned too late to restore what was broken. Their story belonged to the second kind, and although one final reflection remained, the hardest chapters had finally been left behind. Every family has a story people continue talking about, long after the people involved have moved on. Annie realized that her greatest strength had never been the businesses she inherited or the wealth she managed. It was the discipline to remain true to her character when she had every reason to become bitter. That lesson stayed with many who witnessed those events, because they understood how difficult such self-control truly is. Remaining kind when life is easy requires very little effort. Remaining dignified while being publicly disrespected requires something much deeper than confidence. It requires character that cannot be purchased, inherited, or borrowed from anyone else. Several years later, Carter Legacy Holdings celebrated another milestone with the opening of its newest community development project. Hundreds of employees gathered for the ceremony alongside local leaders, nonprofit partners, and residents, whose lives would directly benefit from the investment. Vivian stood before the audience to thank everyone who had contributed to the project. As always, she spoke very little about herself. Instead, she recognized architects, construction workers, nurses, volunteers, project managers, accountants, and maintenance staff whose daily efforts often went unnoticed. After the ceremony, a young business student approached her, carrying a notebook filled with questions. "Mrs. Carter," she asked, "what do you believe is the most important quality for someone who wants to succeed?" Vivian smiled gently before answering. "Competence will open many doors, but character determines what happens after those doors open." The student quickly wrote down every word. Vivian continued, "People will admire success for a season. They will remember integrity for a lifetime." Those standing nearby quietly nodded. Many knew pieces of Vivian's personal history, but very few knew every detail. They didn't need to. Her life already demonstrated the lesson more clearly than any speech ever could. Nathan also continued moving forward. Years of rebuilding his life taught him to appreciate ordinary blessings he once overlooked. He became known among coworkers as someone willing to mentor younger employees without expecting recognition in return. Friends noticed that he listened more carefully than he spoke. He no longer tried to impress people with appearances because experience had shown him how quickly appearances could disappear. One afternoon, a newly married colleague asked him for advice about building a lasting marriage. Nathan smiled thoughtfully before answering with complete honesty. "Never become so comfortable with someone's loyalty that you stop appreciating it." The younger man nodded, believing it was simply good relationship advice. Nathan understood it was something much more personal. Every meaningful lesson carries a price. Some people learn through observation. Others learn through painful experience. He silently hoped the younger man would belong to the first group. As he watched his colleague return to work, Nathan realized that although he could never change his own past, perhaps sharing what he had learned might help someone else protect their future. That possibility gave purpose to mistakes he could no longer undo. Margaret spent her later years repairing relationships that had once seemed beyond repair. She apologized privately to relatives she had spoken harshly to, and gradually earned back their respect through consistent actions rather than emotional promises. She also reached out to Vivian with a handwritten letter. In it, she accepted responsibility for the pain she had caused without offering excuses or asking for anything in return. She simply expressed genuine regret and wished Vivian peace and happiness. Several weeks later, she received a short reply. Vivian thanked her for the letter, accepted the apology, and sincerely wished her well. There was no attempt to rebuild the family as it once existed, because some chapters are meant to remain closed. But forgiveness had quietly replaced resentment, allowing both women to continue their lives without carrying unnecessary burdens from the past. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her family Bible, where it remained for many years as a reminder that humility often arrives only after pride has finished teaching its hardest lessons. As for Emily, she eventually found happiness in a relationship built on honesty from the very beginning. Whenever friends asked how she knew she could trust the man she eventually married, she smiled and answered, "Because I asked difficult questions before making important decisions, and he never hesitated to answer them." She no longer confused confidence with truth or promises with proof. Experience had made her wiser without making her cynical, and she considered that one of life's greatest blessings. Looking back, she no longer viewed herself as someone whose life had been interrupted by another person's deception. Instead, she saw that difficult season as a lesson that protected her from making even greater mistakes later. Sometimes life's hardest chapters quietly prepare people for better ones they cannot yet see. If this story leaves us with one lasting lesson, it is this: never measure someone's worth by how loudly they defend themselves. Some of the strongest people in the world allow truth to speak when the time is right. Vivian never won because she possessed more money, owned more property, or controlled successful companies. Those things may have attracted attention, but they were never the reason people remembered her. She earned respect because she refused to surrender her dignity when others questioned her value. Nathan lost far more than financial comfort. because trust, once broken, is rarely restored to what it once was. Margaret discovered that pride can blind even loving parents when they begin controlling lives that do not belong to them. Emily learned that honesty should never be assumed simply because someone speaks with confidence. And everyone who witnessed that unforgettable gala learned one simple truth. Before celebrating someone else's downfall, make certain you understand the full story. Appearances can be convincing, assumptions can feel comfortable, and pride can sound persuasive. But in the end, facts remain, character endures, and truth always has a way of arriving exactly when it is needed. If you enjoyed this story, let us know your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who appreciates meaningful stories, and subscribe so you never miss another unforgettable journey.